Hey there, everybody. Hope you're having an awesome day. And what we're going to show you right now is an interview that I had the opportunity to do with Dr. Nicholas Baham III at Cal State East Bay. He is a really knowledgeable person regarding anthropology and history. You should check out his book, Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice. And in this conversation we actually talk about the influences that John Coltrane and others like him have had on the world, and we talk about the various factors that contribute to the way that musicians choose to create music. We also talk about the way that people, the African people of diaspora in particular, use music and what it means to us. And we also talk about COVID-19 and the transition to more modern issues that we're facing. At the same time, we even discuss things such as afrofuturism, which were, as the professor informs, really spearheaded by artists of the 20th century, such as Sun Rah and others. And we even learned that Coltrane himself was an Afrofuturist. This is a really interesting conversation that can enrich your mind and give you, it serves as a resource for improving your understanding of all the factors that influenced not only John Coltrane, but many others who were his contemporaries and people who used music to benefit the world. And you can also check out his podcast, Along the Line. Just tell Google to play Along the Line podcast and it'll pop right up. I hope you enjoy. When we look at your book, the Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice, we see an overlap between music, spirituality, social justice, and a lot of people who listen to this show are really into the music, but how do you tie that into social justice and spirituality? For those who tune into the show but might not really be aware of how the music is deeper than just something to listen to.
Well, so jazz music in general, if that's what we're going to call it, and I know that Coltrane himself wanted to term this more of an African classical music. Jazz music and our arts as Black people are essentially our mode of survival. So they are inherently political. And fundamentally, jazz music in and of itself, as with all musics created by African diasporic people, are about freedom and about improvisation. There's probably very few things like this outside of the arts, where there are literally billions of combinations of things that you can do at any moment. Coltrane said, damn the rules, you play all 12 notes of your solo. The music has always been, first of all, affirmative. Second of all, radically diasporic and hybrid, meaning that it's drawn from everything that we had to draw on in order to make up a new culture for ourselves as an enslaved people, with our culture being under constant attack. It's still under constant attack. And then the music is always about freedom. It's about expressing freedom. Most of the listeners to this broadcast understand that freedom. They experience it as listeners, and those amongst our listeners who are musicians experience moments in playing jazz music or any improvised African diasporic music. They experience those moments as moments of freedom. So on a fundamental level, first of all, the music has always been political. We have never, I think, as a people, been able to sort of separate and compartmentalize things out. Everything is political for us. The way we eat, the way we dress, the way we style our hair, our music, our dance, etc., our literature, our poetry, you name it. It's all political. It's always political. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there have been specific movements, political movements, created around jazz music. And the one that I would draw the attention of my readers to and listeners is the triumvirate that was formed by John Coltrane, Yusef Lateef, and Olatunji. In their mission statement, they said, to quote, to regard each other as equal partners in all categories, to not allow any booking agent or promoter to present one group without the other two members of the triumvirate, and three, to explore the possibility of teaching the music of our people in conservatories, colleges, and universities where only European musical experience dominates and is being perpetuated. Right there, that is sort of a decolonizing expression, decolonizing from the control, the moneyed control that separates us so often in the music business, and then also challenging the sort of white classical norms that sort of relegate jazz music into kind of uh, I should say a low art type level, okay? So that is an inherently political statement. They put this together in what was called by a lot of people the October Revolution in jazz. Downbeat has an article of that title in 1964. And this was a kind of a politically consciousness raising moment for a lot of jazz musicians in the 60s who were reacting to a bunch of things: segregation, civil rights movement, Vietnam War, etc. Coltrane's triumvirate wasn't the only one. There was also Horace Tapscott's group, UGMAA, which stood for Union of God's Musicians and Artists Ascension. There was also AACM, the art ensemble in Chicago, with people like Richard Abrams, Steve McCall, Phil Cochran, Jody Christian. These were kind of free jazz artists who were pushing those levels of freedom in the music and improvisation. I could even cite Sun Rah's movement, his Afrofuturistic movement, which I hope we get a chance to talk about today as well,
Oh,
that was
definitely,
pushed.
definitely.
Yeah, it was pushing against boundaries. I mean, Sun Ra's film, which people can still access on YouTube, Space is the Place, filmed here in the Bay Area in Oakland, is a political statement about, you know, really dealing with the kind of oppression that Black people are facing in inner cities, drugs, gangs, um, pimping, prostitution, all these kinds of things that we're facing in these communities. And what alternatives could you present? What kind of awakening politically and culturally you could present to move people out of that kind of thinking about themselves, out of that kind of self-hatred? And that was entirely consistent with some of the ideas that we were hearing in that period from Malcolm X or from SNCC, you know, about Black is beautiful, kind of knowing thyself, understanding your own history, separating yourself mentally from European paradigms that would regard you as lesser than, all of that.
So
So there's, the music is.
as I hear you say these things, it occurs to me that so you just touched on the 70s, the 60s, where you have the Black is beautiful movement, or where people are saying things like that. Those terms become commonplace. Uh, uh, People are redefining how they talk about themselves and how they see themselves in white spaces as uh, they're reframing themselves. As you said, is it the lower people or
Well, remember that jazz, technically speaking, jazz music was, the birth of it was in the red light districts in New Orleans around Storyville. So it existed as a common popular music and remained a common popular music from the turn of the century, from, you know, the 1800s to the 1900s, all the way up through the 70s. It was probably the dominant music in this country. It had quite a long reign. But at the same time, sort of the relegation of that music to a kind of a status of lower art forces people to take it less seriously. But as soon as Charlie Parker stopped dancing on the bandstand and had you pay attention to what he was playing in his short but really poignant solos, the music began to change. The evaluation of the music began to change, and people began to understand it more for the art form that it was and the high art. And technically speaking, I'm not even really making the argument that people like Coltrane or Horace Tapscott or even Charlie Parker embraced a notion of high art. That in and of itself is a European concept. I think that what they really embraced was an African sensibility of the art. With the triumvirate putting itself in communities, it was saying we are both and. We are high art, we are low art, we are art, period. You can dance to it, you can organize politically to it, you can have spirituality around it. I mean, this is why Coltrane wanted to perform in churches, right? In addition to, he understood it wasn't just a music of the clubs, right?
A different paradigm altogether than thinking
Different.
in terms of high art and low art. And
yeah, kind of the thing that you would see in the diaspora. If you and I were in Cuba right now doing this interview, we would likely be walking along on the street. Somebody would start playing a drum. Other people would come in with other instruments and singing and dancing, and people would pour out from their residences to partake in that dancing. You see this in New Orleans. It's always been the culture. It's sort of the African way. Music and dancing are life. Everybody does it. So many years ago when I was in Ghana, that was one of the things that struck me, is that, you know, you don't need to ask anybody, do you play an instrument or do you dance? The answer is always yes, because it is a part of what it means to exist and to be. It is political, it is existential, it is core to your being. You don't separate it off into a compartment like you would do in sort of a Western cultural setting, a Western European setting, right? And you don't just have people playing music and you look at them playing and you sit silently. You are fully engaged. You are talking back to the musician. You are dancing. There is a second line for the dancing and the musicians. There's all kinds of community engagement. So our music is always all encompassing.
okay, and that's because it's all encompassing. It seems like that's why music seems to, and if correct me or disabuse me of the notion if this is not correct, but musicians in a way laid the foundation for radical thought to the extent that they were the first people to authentically be themselves and just, you know, make their music, you know, without conforming in a way. Or,
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. And I would also say that there's an interesting, when you look at African American culture and history, there's an interesting ongoing conversation between musicians and other types of artists, writers, painters, sculptors, etc. You know, you only need to look at something like the history of the Harlem Renaissance to understand how closely knit people were, how much people listened, read, paid attention to what others were doing within that context. Or, for example, to read James Baldwin, who often said that he wanted to write the way that Aretha Franklin sang. I mean, that's a in-your-face statement of the overlap between our artistic expression. All of that is in the avant-garde. All of it is in the avant-garde.
and maybe transitioning to a little bit more of the spiritual aspect of the music, how has music been used as a spiritual tool? If you could speak a little more to that in particular.
Well, if music is a part of your core being, then it is inherently spiritual. But I think it took people like John Coltrane in particular, or, you know, and even Sun Rah, people like Sun Rah and some of the other free jazz artists, to recognize that life is essentially vibration. Anything that lives vibrates, and sound is vibration. Technically speaking, we are on, I know this is going to be a little bit esoteric for our listeners, but this is kind of the direction well, this is definitely the direction that John Coltrane was in. We all have a vibration, we all have a sound. Every planet has a sound. Everything that lives has a sound, right? Your running water, your trees, your air, your birds, the whole thing, everything has a sound, right? If you think about like people like Eric Dolphy figured this out, right? You know, he was a guy who listened to birds in order to create a sound out of his horn. Some of the most elemental music expressions are like this. As an anthropologist, I've read studies of musicians in the Amazon, and these early indigenous musicians, how did they come up with their sounds? By listening to the sounds of life in nature around them. That is an inherently spiritual principle, but a spiritual principle that is sort of pre-European and pre-Christian in its orientation, okay? And I'm not gonna, you know, for the sake of this program, I'm not really gonna debate who I think is right and who I think is wrong. I think that, like Coltrane, that there are many different approaches to this and many different avenues to the truth, okay? As long as what you're trying to do is get to the truth. But sound, you know, where music becomes spiritual is when the musician and the listener recognize that sound is the fundamental element of life. In fact, your Bible begins that way. In the beginning was the Word. The Word is sound. It is the utterance of sound that calls all life into being. So even from a Judeo-Christian perspective, there's an understanding of this too. Now, when you get to people like John Coltrane, who more explicitly call this to attention in, you know, 20th century America, the global 20th century context, there's some very concrete things that I think Coltrane was drawing on. I think for Coltrane, his recognition of that fundamental value of sound as life also meant for him that you could change people's, you know, he has a quote where he says you could change the initial thought patterns of folks. This belief that that in sound is prayer as well. In sound, there is love, there is healing, there is peace. And this is what he was trying to do with his music. To that degree, you know, he was an avatar of everyone now who calls themselves a sound healer or who uses any kind of sound therapy. And we know that many of these things exist right now. And he was, you know, certainly an avatar of everything that we do within our spiritual communities. You can't have church without sound. Would you agree?
Oh, certainly, yes. And as you were speaking, I just, you know, most religious systems and traditions incorporate some form of music. And
Right,
so maybe
right.
music itself is inherently a expression of the human spirit and there, you know, and spiritual in that way.
Yes, even if it's just the ringing of a bell or a gong sound to initiate meditation and to sort of get into that, the reverberations of that sound as one meditates. That is, you know, this sort of linkage of sound and spirituality and healing too. I mean, I think what's really important for John Coltrane is, can you heal? Can you heal souls? Can you heal hearts? Can you heal minds? Can you change people's thinking with music? And one of the things that's wonderful about being a part of the Coltrane global community are the amount of testimonies that people bring to that community about how sound has healed them. And frankly, you know, we're very high on Coltrane's spiritual sound. And I think the reason why is because for Coltrane, there's an intentionality behind that. There's a stated intentionality to heal and a direct purpose. You know, Coltrane was very, after A Love Supreme, he was very direct about, this is what I'm trying to do with my music. I have intention behind everything that I play. and that intention is love. That intention is healing and bringing that through sound. And frankly, one last thing that I will say too, that there's a wonderful, if people are willing to look for it, there's a wonderful conversation. And I put conversation in quotes because they were not sitting down at the same table together. But there's a wonderful conversation between the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John Coltrane. And it begins with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. giving the eulogy for the 4 girls who were killed in the church bombing in Alabama. And then Coltrane recording Alabama, which if listeners will, I've given a few lectures on this too. If listeners listen to both of those at the same time, you will notice how Coltrane's phrasing and his composition is structured in the same manner as King's eulogy, the exact same manner. And then King follows that up later when he's in Berlin at a jazz festival, acknowledging the spiritual, political, cultural power of jazz music as an initiator, not just as a commentator on what exists, but as an avant-garde initiator of these principles.
Great point. Actually, in church on Sunday, there was a reading of that speech that Martin Luther King gave at that festival. And you guys can join us. To all the listeners out there, if you're just tuning in, I just wanted to say, I have Dr. Nicholas Baham here. To those of you who are viewing, you can see his book right there is actually his background. It's Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice. Go ahead and check that out. But I'd like you to speak a little bit more about Sun Rah's movement. Why is that something that stands out to you, the movement that he inspired?
So I've recently gotten into Afrofuturism. Actually, I've always been into Afrofuturism because I've always been something of a comic book and science fiction geek. And but I'm teaching it now, and I am putting out an article very soon on Afrofuturism, actually contrasting Afrofuturism and Afropessimism on the subject of decolonizing Black subjectivities. And I've always been fascinated by Sun Rah because in that sort of way that jazz embraces freedom and embraces a counterculture and a critique of Western Enlightenment and white supremacy and white supremacist ideas, he decided to push this envelope even higher. In fact, he is certainly joined by Coltrane in this. You know, if you think about things like Coltrane's cosmic music recordings, whatever, Coltrane was also an Afrofuturist. But Sun Rah went so far as to claim that he was from another planet, and that on that planet, they did everything with music, whether that's praying or eating or washing your clothes, everything was done with music. Now, the fascinating thing about Afrofuturism is it both is a forward-looking artistic movement, and it's largely an artistic movement more than a theoretical movement. It's both a forward-looking artistic movement and a backward-looking artistic movement. So it reconstructs an African past as much as it constructs an African future. And frankly, if you don't write yourself into the future, you will be excluded from that future. So that sort of projection of African values, sort of global diasporic African values into the future, asserts and provides a position for you in that space. What Sun Rah was largely doing, and again, I would refer the listeners and viewers to his recordings. He sees Afrofuturism as a kind of a paradigm that can get you beyond the initial thinking that you have about what it means to be Black in this world. Okay, think about what the introduction of ideas about Blacks in space in the future would mean, how much of a paradigm shift that would be to an individual who has never left the neighborhood that they've grown up in. Now, I know as a native San Franciscan that I grew up around people who grew up in, say, the Bayview Hunters Point, and rarely, if ever, left the Bayview Hunters Point. By the time that they were well into their teens, had never visited, say, the Mission District or the Sunset District or the whatever. They were located in the Bayview Hunters Point, period. And then you get your hands on somebody, an avant-garde musician who's dressing in these glittering robes that are both sort of sci-fi and African, with a lot of Egyptian imagery in them, right? You get a hold of that guy, and he's talking to you about planets. He's not just talking about you get out of your neighborhood, but he's saying you belong
Right.
out the stars. I mean, that is such an incredible paradigm shift right there. It can potentially blow your mind. And that's precisely what you need in a space like this. You get this from John Coltrane too. It's precisely what you need to get you out, as Parliament Funkadelic would say, to get you out of your constraints.
Right. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying. And what I'm taking away is that music can be a tool that serves many, many purposes. It can be used to express spirituality. It can be used as a means to heal others through having them experience the sound. And I'd like to transition a little bit more to a quote from your book here. And it says, and you write, "The enduring belief in the spirituality of jazz music pioneer John William Coltrane, and the investment in him as a cultural phenomenon and a focal point for a counter-hegemonic ideology against the backdrop of urban Black politics, religion, and culture, illuminates a complex historical relationship of African American people to their aesthetics and the use of music in particular as a vehicle for building meaningful communities and politics of cultural representation." So I think does that kind of speak to what you were talking about, how
Yeah.
he can use, how sound and music is used to reframe and challenge the hegemony of the day?
Yes, exactly. And for me, because the book isn't always esoteric. There are esoteric chapters in the book, but for the most part, I would say that 90% of the book deals with how that plays out against the backdrop of real political events in the city of San Francisco. In other words, how the church, the St. John Will I Am Coltrane African Orthodox Church, not only worked and continues to work to change people's thinking and to shift the paradigm, how you think about yourself, how you think about yourself within the global community, et cetera, but also to have an impact on real political events. So on that more sort of that broader ideological level, the church itself has taken Coltrane's avant-garde ideas and run with them completely. Everything from anti-racism, anti-sexism, the fact that the church is now run by Pastor Juanica, which, by the way, most Black churches have not caught up with yet. There are some, but certainly not anywhere near a reasonable majority, okay, or plurality of churches have embraced the leadership of women, the universality of religious ideas. Yes, the Unitarians have kind of been there, right? But we needed a deeper embrace of other ideas than Judeo-Christian ideas within Black communities, because Black folk have always been reaching for Eastern mysticism and a variety of different other ideas to meet their needs. So on an ideological level, yeah, it's happening. But on another level too, those ideas get translated into real action by the Coltrane Church. So while redevelopment is going on and gentrification is going on, It's the Coltrane Church that's on the front lines of, fighting against these foreclosures. It's the Coltrane Church that's on the front lines of dealing with these police murders, and are actually one of the organizations that's behind getting the first Black sheriff in San Francisco, getting this accountability where the citizenry can show up to a crime scene a half hour after it's happened. Of course, Gavin Newsom got rid of that because he understood the power of that kind of thing. And also, fighting against environmental racism. In particular, I detail the fight against the Lennar Corporation and their construction and demolition in the Bayview Hunters Point, which was, bringing up all of that asbestos, toxic asbestos into the air, and raising rates of asthma and cancer in the Bayview Hunters Point amongst its largely Black citizenry. They were on the front lines of that too. And they continue to be on the front lines of social justice movements aligned with whomever else is speaking the truth. They're not tripping. Archbishop King and Mother Marina and Pastor Juanica are not tripping about whether you're a Muslim or you're a Buddhist or you're a Hindu or you're a Jew. What they're tripping about is, are you standing in the truth in terms of that social justice mission, that love mission, that kind of thing that we're supposed to be embracing in the Gospels, but often aren't, because we are also living in an era of hypocrisy. And that's really the danger of not changing your paradigm from these Western hegemonic ideas. You can fall into hypocrisy. You can fall into these spaces where people are arguing for things that are contrary to the Gospels, if you're a Christian, and at the same time putting on the robe, pretending that they are a part of this mission, when all we know that they really care about is money. That's it. And whiteness, money and whiteness. And
like heresies, right?
Right. This is why we now, in my opinion, we are now living in an era of heretical Christianity. And if you don't have community-based organizations that are speaking against everything from anti-racism to other social justice issues, right? Fair housing, food for the poor. Some of the stuff that was in the Black Panther Party platform, right? If you don't have organizations that are speaking to that, you're lost.
That's interesting, because Archbishop once said, well, the church's roots are kind of linked to the Black Panther Party to some extent. And the food programs and all those things that you were mentioning, yeah, it goes hand in hand with that, as you said. I'd love to kind of switch gears just a little bit, and to make sure that we have time to let listeners know what they can learn about the things that you're up to currently now. Do you want to say what you're speaking about on your next podcast, or is there anything that I know you're writing a book, and you have another one that you have in the works?
Yeah, so I have, unfortunately, I'm in that situation where I have multiple projects that I'm working on. I'll talk about a couple of them, but let me talk first about the podcast. So I have been doing a critical media literacy podcast called Along the Line with an organization called Project Censored. And the idea for Project Censored is to promote kind of an awareness about how to sift through media. Fake news, in other words. And I don't mean fake news in the sense in which Grumpf uses the term fake news. Oftentimes what he's doing with that is he is labeling legitimate journalistic integrity, reporting with that kind of integrity, as fake news, because it contradicts with the fantasies that he has in his own head. But there are ways to be able to sift out truth and facts in a story, and we kind of promote that. One of the things that we've been doing on the broadcast that I've been investigating is I've been doing a series called the COVID Chronicles. and I've been interviewing people across the country. Because I'm sheltered in place, I've just sort of gone deep into my contacts, people that I've known since maybe even the mid to late 1980s, who are in different parts of the world right now and who can speak to what's happening in their communities. One of the better interviews that I got recently, which will debut soon, was an interview with a physician at Massachusetts General, who's also the developer of something called the COVID symptom tracker. And we were able to talk not only about his app and about the issues of privacy and security around his app, but and also about how the app could help us going forward to mitigate further, kind of hotspots that come up as people begin to ignore social distancing. But we also were talking about, are things is the curve beginning to flatten as far as he sees it at Massachusetts General, and what the situation is like, what the experience of having COVID-19 is like as well. So I've interviewed to date people everywhere from Miami to Mobile, Alabama, New York, San Francisco. I'm going around the country, and I'm looking for more interviews right now in the middle of the country. I'm hoping to have one lined up soon in Ohio, where that individual can speak about what Governor Mike DeWine has put into place and what's happened in their localities. As for the writing, I am working to push out a piece on Afrofuturism, contrasting Afrofuturism and Afropessimism. And I think this is the first time that anybody's done this, to put those two ideas together and see, especially around the subject of decolonization, and to determine not only if it's possible to decolonize according to each of these theories, but how one would do it and what are the compatibilities between these ideas. And these two are really the main ideas that we're seeing in universities right now in Black studies. Those are Afropessimism and Afrofuturism, are kind of the cutting edge ideas presently. I'm also, the last thing that I will mention, but I'm mentioning this just to keep pushing myself. I am really a huge fan of James Baldwin and teach courses on Baldwin. Had a chance to meet him when I was in college. It totally changed my life. And I've written a few pieces on James Baldwin, which I'm trying to get put into a collection of West Coast scholars who have written about James Baldwin as well.
Okay, and I mean, if I may, just for a moment, step back to your points on the coronavirus and the importance of media literacy. Is one of the things that I saw recently is like a treatment for the virus, which was advocated on Fox News, actually is not effective, even though it's been endorsed by the president. So so it's no small thing. It's very important, especially in the context of this epidemic, that people become more able to ascertain the truth as they go through the media. And I was wondering, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is a source for the confusion? Or, because I mean, there's a lot of debates on things that aren't debatable, right? Like, can we afford Medicare for all, for instance, or other issues which informed people would consider this is not something to debate. What do you think is the cause of confusion or the lack of unity? Why is it so important for us to have people like you to teach us about this?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that make this very confusing for us right now. For one, we have been living in an anti-science America for quite some time. So that's fundamental. If you're going to survive during the corona crisis, you've got to pay attention to the science. That's all there is to it. So, if you're going to turn on these daily press briefings, which I don't recommend because they're full of misinformation. If you're going to do it, though, pay attention to what the scientists say when they get up and they contradict the individual who now occupies the White House. We saw that dramatically yesterday, where he was trying to insist that this thing was, again, this is all going to go away by the fall. And then Dr. Fauci came up and said, dude, no, nope. That's, that's not science. That's wishful thinking. That's all. But that's not wishful. You cannot put your life and the lives of your family and loved ones on the line behind the wishful thinking of someone who doesn't read. And that brings me to my next point. Reading, literacy is poor. I mean, we still exist in a country where people feel like some stupid, homespun country wisdom is better than actually reading and researching anything. And those of us who read and research are simply elites, and we think that we're better than everybody else. That's inaccurate. I'm not better than anybody else. And I tell my students all the time, you can have exactly, what you think I have. The only difference between the two of us is I might have read a couple more books than you have. You can read those books. It is totally attainable. But we don't actually teach that. What we teach in this country is division between those who are educated and literate and those who are not. And I think that by the time we're done with COVID-19, you're going to see the impact that this has had on communities that have lower rates of literacy. Because you simply can't get the information that you need, the critical information that you need, by looking at Fox News. That is a source for illiterate individuals, and it promotes illiteracy. So I would say the first two things are the anti-science thing is at issue here, and the anti-literacy. But I'm going to point to another one too. I think race is central to everything in this country. I'm just going to break it down to you, brother. Because when I talk to folks in the South and doing the COVID Chronicles, I have an Athens, Georgia interview as well with a brother who's a jazz musician. That will be coming out soon too. That's really worth listening to. He's got some incredible insight. But he talked to me about how, in his view, people are still fighting the Civil War in their COVID response. So the attitude is still, well, this is what these damn Yankees are doing. We're definitely not going to do that. And then when they started to publish data about how this disease is affecting people of color, specifically African Americans, at a higher rate, I got really worried then. I remain worried now. If you notice, we started talking about opening up shortly after those statistics became public. Because the feeling in this country always, and I'm not just being paranoid or race baiting.
Oh, you don't have to worry about that here. We know you can.
Because I think anybody who is willing to look at this reasonably will understand what I'm saying and will appreciate this as truthful. If you begin to talk about something as impacting Black people more than other people, that's the time when they pull out. I mean, look at what they did with the crack epidemic. It did not receive nearly as much attention as we got on the opioid epidemic. Although the opioid epidemic thing is also kind of an okie doke has been played on white folk there too. They promised a whole lot to poor white folk, and they haven't given him anything. But they have talked about it, and they've talked about it in ways that they didn't talk about the crack epidemic. I'll give you one more example. There's a lot of stuff happening right now because of the reopening of the investigation of the Atlanta child murders by Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. Well, so you can, there's a new HBO series on it. There was a Netflix series, Mindhunter, that culminated in those murders. And I've actually gone back to reading James Baldwin's book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, on that. Anybody who lived through that period remembered that we're talking over 30 Black youth killed. And it took forever to get any kind of federal FBI response on it and to take that thing seriously. And yet, people like me also remember that they were all over JonBenet Ramsey. It takes one little white girl to get that kind of publicity But you got to get up to about 30 black people plus to get that kind of publicity. And I'm not saying that John Benet Ramsey's life isn't valuable. It is. They should have paid attention to John Benet Ramsey, for sure. But they also should have paid attention to the first black kid who disappeared like that in Atlanta and paid the same level of attention to it that got paid to this one little white girl, because both of their lives are valuable, both of them. So I think race is playing a role in this, to be sure. And I also think that there's still aspects of the Civil War that are being negotiated in the red states. I think that, again, it's hard to sort of disengage race from Trumpism, because racism is so central to Trumpism, that I see it continuing to play out. The other piece here too that you have to remember is that in the media circus around COVID-19, there are things that are happening racially that we're not paying attention to, like Trump's ongoing attack on immigrants of color. That's happening while we're paying attention to the sort of COVID-19 comedy hour that he's putting on in his daily press briefings.
It sounds like it's all linked to the American culture that has developed over the centuries, a culture of excluding the other and the minority, and brushing their problems or letting. I'm sorry, what were you saying there, Doctor?
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's first of all, it's racist. It's also sexist, okay? It's anti-literacy, and it's anti-science, all wrapped in together. And I would also say to you that when I make this comment, I don't want the listeners and the viewers to think, okay, well, here I go, towards my Joe Biden endorsement. I'm not doing that, because everyone is letting us down, everyone in power. If you look at that coronavirus bill, really what we need, let's be real, okay? The recession or the depression that we're going to face, and we are facing because of COVID-19, is a demand side depression. What you really need is $2,000 a month, universal basic income, going into everybody's pocket in this country who is below a certain income level, period. That's what you need. And I don't know what that income level would be, but I got to tell you that people who are in that space, for sure, where you're making under 150,000, maybe even 100,000, all the way on down to folks who are just barely making it through on 20, 25 grand a year or less. And I'm tired, I'll be honest with you, Franzo, I'm tired of driving around, especially in the Bay Area, where we've got all of this tech wealth, and seeing how hard COVID-19 is hitting houseless persons. These people are being looked at as invisible. No one is talking about what kind of relief you can provide for people on the street. I understand that, the city of San Francisco has been trying to do some stuff to provide housing. But let me ask you this question. Hotels are shut down all across America. Hotel rooms are shut down. Why aren't we offering those hotel rooms? The city of San Francisco alone has enough hotel rooms, and technically the Bay Area alone has enough vacant housing to be able to house all homeless persons. There's more vacant housing in the Bay Area than there are homeless persons. And I could probably say that of almost any region in America. But because we don't have a social justice ethic, the kind of stuff we talked about at the beginning of this interview, because we do not have that social justice ethic, we do not even think about these kinds of things. We have leaders who are afraid to debate these kinds of things. And instead, we seem to be okay with just driving by and watching folk die on the street. I started writing a piece the other day where I was reflecting on this brother that I see in Berkeley. He's on Oxford Avenue, right at the western edge of the University of California, Berkeley. The Berkeley lawn ends right there, okay? He is sleeping on top of a grate over a steam tunnel. So there's steam escaping from this all day. He's laid down about 2 or 3 layers of blankets and his sleeping bag on top of that. And people are passing him by every day. What is wrong? I mean, what are we doing we're going to be judged for that as a society. And now more than ever, that man has to be housed in some space that can house him. And it's ironic because he's right next to all this wonderful construction that's still going on. This construction that's being regarded as necessary labor is happening right next to him as he lays there over a steam tunnel on Oxford Avenue. It's disgusting. Just I should go out there and just take a picture of it to give that contrast between the wealth and gentrification exemplified by that construction, and obviously also the university itself, and that man just sleeping on that grate. It breaks my heart.